The weather people called it a significant rain event. That's like calling a charging rhinoceros a medium-sized horned mammal with a bad attitude. This wasn't just rain. It was a biblical threat, a sky-born assault with a personal grudge against my shingles. The drops were the size of marbles, and they were hitting the windows of my garage with a percussive fury that sounded like 1,000 tiny, angry drummers. But I was calm. I was serene. Because in my garage, my sanctuary of solder and steel, I had my equalizer. She was parked on a custom-built, dual-axle trailer, a magnificent gray metal box the size of a smart car. Wires, thick as a bodybuilder's wrist, snaked from her sides into a control panel that bristled with heavy-duty switches, analog dials, and glowing LED indicators. A low, resonant hum emanated from deep within her, the sound of pure, unadulterated potential. This was my baby, my masterpiece, my portable power substation, affectionately known as the Beast. My phone buzzed on the workbench, another screeching emergency alert from the National Weather Service. Flash flood warning in your area. Seek higher ground immediately. I glanced at the alert and chuckled. Higher ground? I had made my own higher ground, metaphorically speaking. Now, you might be asking yourself, what kind of well-adjusted member of suburban society owns a piece of equipment that could power a small music festival? The answer is, a man who has his priorities straight. I'm Alex Peterson, and I'm an electrical engineer. I consult on large-scale power infrastructure projects, the kind of stuff that keeps cities from going dark. I've seen what happens when the grid gets flaky. But my obsession, my glorious, over-engineered obsession, wasn't just born from professional experience. It was forged in the fires of personal tragedy. 4 years ago, on a crisp September afternoon, a squirrel with a death wish and an unfortunate sense of curiosity met his maker inside a transformer down the street. The resulting explosion plunged our entire subdivision into darkness for 3 full days. 3 days that just happened to coincide with the Fantasy Football Championship, a title I was poised to win. I lost. I lost because I couldn't update my roster. I lost a year's worth of bragging rights and a sizable pot to my smug brother-in-law because of a suicidal rodent. That night, sitting in the dark, listening to the condescending hum of my neighbor's dinky generator powering his beer fridge, I made a vow. Never again would my fate be tied to the whims of public utilities and acrobatic vermin. So, I built the Beast, a 20-kilowatt diesel generator, meticulously soundproofed, feeding a bank of inverters and step-up transformers, all wired to a central command panel that gave me granular control over every amp and volt. It was overkill. It was absurd. And it was the most beautiful thing I had ever created. My current source of pride, however, was humming away in the basement. A state-of-the-art flood prevention system. Not just one sump pump, but a tri-redundant array of commercial-grade pumps, each capable of evacuating 10,000 gallons per hour. They were hooked to their own dedicated, high-amperage circuit, wired with armored conduit directly to the main junction box outside. The system was my shield against the aquatic apocalypse currently unfolding outside, and it was the source of my war with the dragon. Her name was Karen von Stroheim, president of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association, a woman who seemed to have been born with a clipboard fused to her hand and a permanent expression of disappointed disapproval. Harmony Creek was one of those master-planned communities where the houses were all 50 shades of beige, and the height of your grass was regulated with more scrutiny than national airspace. It was a peaceful, soul-crushingly pleasant place to live, provided you had no personality you wished to express. My first run-in with Karen occurred 3 months prior, on a sunny Saturday. I'd just finished installing the discharge pipe for my new pump system. It was a modest 1-inch PVC pipe, painted to match the foundation and tucked discreetly behind a large azalea bush. You'd need a thermal imaging satellite to spot it. An hour later, she was at my door. "Mr. Peterson," she'd said, without any preamble. She never said hello. Hellos were inefficient and not covered by any bylaw. "Karen," I replied, leaning against the doorframe. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Did someone's recycling bin exceed the maximum permissible curb weight again?" She did not smile. I'm not entirely sure the muscles in her face were capable of it. "I'm here regarding a violation. Your unapproved sump pump discharge pipe." I blinked. "The one behind the bush? The one that's invisible to the naked human eye? That one?" She consulted her clipboard, as if the answer might be found there. "It is a non-standardized external modification. It violates Bylaw 7, Section 4, Subsection C, Aesthetic Harmony of Drainage Solutions. The white PVC, even painted, clashes with the approved aggregate taupe of your foundation." "Karen," I said slowly, carefully. "It's a drainage pipe. Its job is to drain. Its aesthetic is secondary to its function. With all due respect, if we get the kind of flood this thing is built for, the aesthetic harmony of my entire finished basement will be early shipwreck chic. I'm not changing it." Her eyes narrowed. "The bylaws are not suggestions, Mr. Peterson. They are the covenant that protects our property values and our way of life. My property value will be approximately 0 if it's full of mud and dead fish, Karen." That was the declaration of war. In the following weeks, I received a series of laminated notices, each one more threatening than the last. They cited new, increasingly obscure violations. The pipe was a potential tripping hazard. For whom? Garden gnomes. It produced intermittent and unapproved hydraulic acoustics, the sound of it working. I used the notices as coasters on my workbench, each coffee ring a tiny act of defiance. Back in the garage, the storm raged on. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call, not an alert. The caller ID read, "Dave, next door." I answered on speaker. "Talk to me, Dave." "Alex! Oh God, Alex, it's a nightmare!" His voice was a high-pitched squeak of pure panic. "The window wells. They're full. It looks like 2 sad, muddy aquariums, and my garden gnome, Sir Reginald, is underwater up to his little red hat. He's drowning, Alex." I glanced at my monitor bank. A beautiful wall of green lights. The pumps were cycling perfectly, handling the deluge with contemptuous ease. The water level in my sump pit hadn't risen by more than a few inches. A smug, warm feeling spread through my chest. The feeling of being right. "Relax, Dave," I said, taking a sip of my lukewarm coffee. "Deep breaths. Sir Reginald is ceramic. He can hold his breath for a long time. My system is handling everything. We're going to be fine." "Are you sure?" he squeaked. "Dave," I said with the supreme confidence of a man who has brought a cannon to a knife fight, "I've got this." And then the world went silent. It wasn't a total power outage. The overhead fluorescent lights in the garage flickered for a second, then held steady. My coffee maker was still on, but the hum was gone. The deep, reassuring thrum from the pumps in the basement had vanished. I stared at my monitor bank. Every single green light had blinked to a terrifying solid red before the screen went completely black. Dead. My blood ran cold. "Alex? What was that?" Dave's voice was a tinny whisper from the phone. "Stay put, Dave," I muttered, my mind already racing through a diagnostic checklist. I sprinted from the garage into the house, my boots thudding on the hardwood floor. I threw open the basement door and was met not with the roar of my pumps, but with the sickening sound of water trickling. The sump pit, which had been held at a steady, manageable level, was now filling up alarmingly fast. I checked the main breaker panel in the utility room. Everything was fine. The house had power. I flipped the dedicated 40-amp breaker for the pump system off and on again. Nothing. The circuit was dead. But how? It was a direct line. It didn't rely on any other circuits in the house. A dark, impossible thought began to form in my mind, a thought so audacious, so utterly malevolent, that it couldn't possibly be true. She wouldn't dare. I grabbed my heavy-duty rain slicker from the hook by the back door and plunged out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly ripped the door from my hand. The rain was a physical force, blurring the world into a churning watercolor of gray and green. I didn't care. I stomped through the mud and pooling water of my side yard, following the path of the thick, armored conduit I had buried myself. It ran from the side of my house to the community utility junction box, a drab green metal cabinet mounted on a concrete slab near the property line. As I got closer, my heart hammered against my ribs. The cabinet door was slightly ajar. I wrenched it open, and my stomach dropped. Inside was a row of heavy-duty circuit breakers. My eyes went straight to the one I had installed, the one clearly labeled in embossed tape. 12 Peterson Pump System. The big black switch wasn't in the on position. It had been thrown, deliberately and with force, into the off position. And securing it there, threaded through the lockout hole on the switch, was a bright orange heavy-duty padlock. Stamped on the side of the lock was the unmistakable, professionally engraved logo of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association. She had done it. The absolute madwoman had actually done it. Taped to the inside of the cabinet door, perfectly protected from the torrential rain by a thick, clear lamination sheet, was a freshly printed notice. The laser-printed ink was crisp and severe. Final notice of violation and immediate cessation of unauthorized utility usage, per HOA. Bylaw 11 Section 2. All external power draws for non-standard appliances must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee. This circuit has been deemed non-compliant, and its power access has been suspended to prevent further unauthorized use of community-managed utilities. Power will be restored upon removal of the offending discharge pipe and payment of all accrued fines and fees. Signed, K. von Stroheim, President, Harmony Creek HOA. I stood there, soaked to the bone, the rain plastering my hair to my forehead. I wasn't even angry at first. I was in awe. The sheer, weaponized pettiness of it was a thing to behold. To come out here, in this storm, with her little padlock and her laminated notice, and cut the power to a flood prevention system, it wasn't just a violation of common sense, it was a masterpiece of malice. I looked at her handiwork. The smug orange lock, the condescending official-looking notice. I looked at my house, where thousands of dollars in electronics, furniture, and memories in my newly finished basement were now at the mercy of the rising water. Then I looked back toward my garage, where the dark, powerful silhouette of the beast sat waiting, humming with untapped potential. And a slow, wicked, glorious grin spread across my face. My first thought wasn't about the water. It wasn't about the damage or the cost. No, my first coherent thought, the one that cut through the disbelief, was, you have no idea what you've just done. It was the feeling a Bond villain gets right before he reveals the giant space laser. A beautiful, terrible, electrifying feeling. She didn't just flip a switch, she declared war. She brought a laminated notice to a flood fight. And in that moment I realized she had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought she was an administrator enforcing a rule. I was about to become a public utility. I didn't run back to the garage. I moved with the kind of focused, deliberate purpose that only comes from absolute certainty. I tore open the main garage door, the howling wind and rain creating a dramatic entrance worthy of the moment. The beast was waiting. With practiced efficiency, I unhooked the trickle charger, kicked the wheel chocks away, and hitched the trailer to my Ford F-150. The trailer hitch clicked into place with a satisfying metallic thunk. I jumped into the truck's cabin, the engine roaring to life and mingling with the sound of the storm. With the big side mirrors, I expertly backed the entire rig out of the garage and positioned it squarely in the middle of my driveway, its powerful LED work lights cutting twin beams through the deluge. The beast was now in position. My front door creaked open, and Dave poked his head out. His face was a pale mask of confusion and terror. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and he was clutching a decorative throw pillow to his chest like a life raft. "Alex!" he yelled, his voice barely audible over the storm and the idling truck. What in God's name is that thing? It sounds like a 747 is trying to land on your azaleas." I vaulted out of the truck and grinned at him, feeling a surge of pure adrenaline. That, Dave, is my off-grid solution. A declaration of energy independence. Karen was so concerned about me using community power, I decided to become my own community. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some bylaws to circumvent. I strode to the side of the beast and slapped open the main control panel door. The interior was a beautiful, orderly testament to my obsession. Neatly routed wires, glowing status lights, and the main diesel generator starter sequence. I went through the startup checklist, my hands moving with muscle memory. Fuel line open, air intake clear, preheater engaged. Then, I flipped the large, red, spring-loaded cover off the ignition switch. I took a deep, satisfying breath and pressed the button. The starter motor whirred for a second, followed by a deep, guttural cough. Then, with a roar that shook the very air, the 20-kilowatt diesel engine inside the beast ignited. The low hum erupted into a thunderous, throbbing powerhouse of sound. It wasn't just noise, it was a statement. It was the sound of overwhelming, unapologetic power. Dave flinched, retreating slightly into his doorway. "Good Lord, Alex!" "It's a little loud on startup," I shouted over the din. "It'll quiet down once it's stable." I turned my attention to the business end. From a storage compartment, I unspooled a 50-foot length of 4/0 feeder cable. A monstrous black python of a wire, thick enough to be a structural support. I slung it over my shoulder and marched to the side of my house, where the manual override input for my pump system was located, a feature I'd installed for just such an emergency, though I'd pictured a more conventional generator, not a mobile power station. I wrenched open the waterproof housing, plugged the massive connector in with a twist and a click, and marched back to the control panel of the beast. The dials were all in the green. The engine had settled into a steady, chest-rattling drone. It was time to deliver the payload. My eyes scanned the panel. Main generator output. Inverter control. And there it was. A huge, satisfying industrial-grade knife switch labeled External Load. It was the kind of switch you see in old Frankenstein movies, the kind that makes you feel powerful just by looking at it. I grabbed the insulated handle, my grin widening. "Let there be light," I muttered to myself, and with a heave that felt deeply, primally satisfying, I threw the switch. Clack-thunk! For a split second, the engine noise deepened as it took the load. The lights on the panel flickered. Then, from the basement, came a sound more beautiful than any symphony. The simultaneous, ferocious roar of 3 commercial-grade sump pumps kicking on at full power. A moment later, a torrent of water, a veritable fire hose of displaced floodwater, erupted from the discharge pipe behind the azaleas. It wasn't the gentle stream from before. This was a pressurized, angry jet of water, blasting into the overflowing storm drain with triumphant force, carving a new channel in my mulch. The system wasn't just working, it was working with a vengeance. I stood there in the rain, hands on my hips, drenched, deafened by the roar of my creation, and I had never felt so alive. The war had begun, and I had just fired the opening salvo. The triumphant roar of the beast and the gushing water from my discharge pipe had an almost magnetic effect. It didn't take long for the dragon to emerge from her lair. Karen von Stroheim appeared as if materializing from the rain itself. She was clad in a canary-yellow raincoat and matching boots, a stark splash of color against the gray misery of the storm. In one hand, she clutched a large golf umbrella, a flimsy and utterly useless shield against the gale-force wind and the spray being thrown from my now supercharged drainage system. Her face, peeking out from under her hood, was a thundercloud of pure, unadulterated rage. She marched across her immaculate, and rapidly becoming less immaculate, lawn, her boots squelching in the saturated turf. She stopped at the edge of my driveway, a safe distance from the beast but close enough to have to shout. "Peterson!" she screeched, her voice cutting through the mechanical drone. "What is the meaning of this?" I adopted a casual pose, leaning against the fender of my truck. "Just a little light engineering, Karen, problem-solving in action. You can't have this thing here." She gestured wildly at the beast, her umbrella threatening to turn inside out. "This is a clear violation of at least a dozen bylaws, noise ordinances, vehicle parking regulations. It's a commercial apparatus." I held up a finger. A professor about to school a particularly dense student. Let's break that down, shall we? First, it's a vehicle on a trailer, parked on my private driveway, so it's not violating any street parking rules. Second, the noise you're hearing is the beautiful sound of my property value being preserved, a service for which you should probably be thanking me. Think of it as an acoustic representation of proactive home maintenance. And third, it's not a commercial apparatus. It's my personal hobby. Like some guys have model trains, I have a mobile power grid. It's very therapeutic. "It's horrifying," she spat, droplets of rain and indignation flying from her lips. "And it is powering an illegal drainage system that you were officially notified to disable." "Yes, about that notice," I said, my voice dripping with false sincerity. "I have to commend you. The lamination was a really nice touch, very professional. Shows you were thinking ahead. But you see, you created a bit of a legal paradox. You demanded I stop using community-managed utilities." "So I am. This is my utility, my power, my generator, my fuel. I am in full compliance with your demand. I'm off your grid. You're welcome." Her face went from red to a sort of pale purple. She was sputtering, unable to form a coherent sentence. Her authority, the very foundation of her existence, had been bypassed with diesel and defiance. She finally managed to get her phone out, her fingers stabbing at the screen. "I am calling the police!" she shrieked. "You have created a public nuisance. They will shut you down." "You do that," I said with a cheerful wave. "I'm sure they're not busy at all right now." Sure enough, less than 10 minutes later, a police cruiser, its blue and red lights painting the swirling rain in hypnotic flashes, pulled up to the curb. A man who looked like he had personally seen the end of the world 3 times already. This shift climbed out. He was tall, with a weary face and a sigh that seemed to be a permanent part of his anatomy. This was Officer Miller. He trudged up the driveway, his eyes taking in the whole ridiculous scene. Karen, vibrating with rage under her umbrella. Me, looking smug and soaked. And the centerpiece, the beast, thundering away like a heavy metal concert. "Okay, folks," Officer Miller said, his voice a gravelly monotone that somehow managed to be heard over the engine. "Let's all take a deep breath and try to keep the biblical floods to a minimum, ma'am. What seems to be the problem that requires my presence in the middle of a hurricane? "Officer, thank you for coming," Karen gushed, seeing him as her savior. "This man, my neighbor, is operating an unlicensed industrial power facility in a residential area. It's deafening. He has performed unpermitted modifications to his home, and he's using this monster to power an illegal pump that is causing erosion and flooding the storm drain." Officer Miller turned his tired eyes to me. I gave him a slight nod. "Officer, allow me to rephrase for accuracy. This woman, the HOA president, trespassed on community utility property to illegally terminate a power circuit to my home's flood prevention system during a declared state of emergency. This," I patted the beast's metal flank, "is my personal property. It's a generator on a registered trailer, which is perfectly legal. It is currently preventing my basement from turning into Lake Michigan, a situation caused entirely by her malicious actions. If anyone's creating a public nuisance, it's the person who thinks HOA bylaws trump state laws about reckless endangerment." Miller's eyebrows went up a fraction of an inch. He walked over to the beast, shining his powerful flashlight over its control panel and connections. He was no fool. He could see it was a professional, well-maintained piece of equipment, not some rusty generator held together with duct tape. He looked at the thick cable running to my house. He looked at my dry foundation. Then he cast his gaze across the street, where water was visibly creeping up the lawns of other houses. He turned back to me. "Is this thing grounded properly?" "To a 10-foot copper rod driven into the earth right next to the front wheel, per National Electric Code 250.34, I replied instantly. "I'm a licensed electrical engineer. It's safer than half the houses on this block." He nodded slowly, then fixed his gaze on Karen. "Ma'am, did you cut the power to his pumps?" "He was in violation of a legally binding covenant," she insisted, her voice shrill. "That's not a no," Miller stated flatly. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment, thick with the drumming of the rain. "Ma'am, from where I'm standing, this looks like a civil matter between you and him. A very, very loud civil matter. But given the weather emergency, I'm not in the business of shutting down the only thing that seems to be preventing property damage. My advice to you is to go home and stay dry. My advice to you, sir," he said, turning to me, "is to try and keep the noise down if you can." "I'll see what I can do, officer," I said with my most charming smile. He gave a final, weary shake of his head, got back in his cruiser, and drove off into the night, leaving Karen standing on the sidewalk, utterly defeated. Her ultimate weapon, calling the authorities, had backfired completely. She shot me a look of pure hatred, turned, and sloshed back to her house. The victory was sweet, but short-lived. A new phase of the evening was about to begin. As the night wore on, the storm's intensity didn't wane. And soon, I had new visitors. It started with Dave. He shuffled over, looking sheepish. "Alex, my pump, the one from the hardware store, I think it gave up the ghost. I can hear gurgling." I sighed. "All right, Dave, pop your garage. Let's see what you've got." I grabbed a heavy-duty extension cord, plugged it into one of the beast's auxiliary 120-volt outlets, and ran it over to his garage. We managed to get his pathetic little pump working again, but it was like trying to bail out the Titanic with a teaspoon. Then, Mr. Henderson from 2 doors down appeared, a frantic look in his eyes. He was in his pajamas and a rain jacket. "Peterson, my man cave. My signed Tom Brady jersey is down there. My pump's not keeping up. I'll give you $100. Before I could even answer, Mrs. Garcia from across the street was at the edge of my driveway, yelling, "Alex, please! We're taking on water in the playroom. I'll bake you bread for a year, any kind you want." It was a flood, both of water and of requests. My little act of personal defiance was escalating. Dave, seeing the tide turning, both literally and figuratively, suddenly found a new purpose. He ran back inside and emerged with a notepad and a pen. "Okay," he announced, now my self-appointed dispatcher. "The Hendersons at 4B need a line for their main pump. The Garcias at 6A have a secondary pump, but no power in their basement. The Lees at 2B think their pump is clogged, but they need power for a wet vac." I looked at Dave, then at the desperate faces of my neighbors, then at the thundering, magnificent beast. I had become the neighborhood's reluctant, slightly unhinged folk hero. "All right, Field Marshal Dave," I said, unable to suppress a grin. "Let's get to work." I opened another compartment on the beast, revealing a rack of neatly spooled extension cords of every gauge and length. "Start running lines," I commanded. "This is now the Harmony Creek microgrid, and I am its benevolent god." For the next 2 hours, under the relentless assault of the storm, we built our network. My driveway became the nerve center, a chaotic but functional web of thick black and orange cables snaking out across lawns, over driveways, and into the garages of my grateful neighbors. The beast handled the increased load without a single complaint, its engine maintaining a steady, reassuring rhythm. I was a warlord of watts, a sultan of sockets, doling out life-saving power to my supplicants. And with every home I connected, every basement I helped save, I could feel Karen's angry glare boring into the back of my head from her darkened window across the street. The storm finally broke just before dawn. The torrential rain softened to a drizzle, and a bruised purple light began to seep into the eastern sky. The world was sodden and battered. Tree branches littered the streets, and a river of muddy water still flowed down the gutters. But on my side of the street, the houses stood like defiant islands in a sea of misery. Lawns were damp, but not flooded. Basements were dry. The same could not be said for Karen's house. As the sun rose higher, the full scope of the karmic blowback became clear. Her prize-winning Petunia bed, a source of immense pride and the subject of at least 3 fawning HOA newsletter articles, was gone. It had been washed away, replaced by a deep, muddy trench. The water, having overwhelmed the storm drains, had sought a new path, and it had chosen her property. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. Her own basement, as I would later learn from the neighborhood grapevine, had taken on more than a foot of water. Her standard-issue builder-grade sump pump had, of course, failed spectacularly. My driveway still looked like the backstage of a rock concert. The beast was idling peacefully now, the load on it having lessened as pumps finished their work. I was enjoying a fresh, hot cup of coffee, sitting on the tailgate of my truck, when a large, clean work truck rumbled down the street and pulled up in front of my house. The logo on the side read, "Gus and Rico's Electrical and Engineering." Gus, a burly man with a barrel chest and a laugh that could shake dust from the rafters, hopped out of the driver's side. His partner, Rico, a tall, silent man built like a telephone pole, emerged from the passenger side. They were the contractors who had helped me with the initial installation of my pump system, 2 of the finest, no-nonsense pros I'd ever worked with. Gus took in the scene. The beast, the web of cables, the general air of post-battle exhaustion, and let out a low whistle that turned into a booming laugh. "Well, I'll be," he said, shaking his head in admiration. "Alex, when you called this morning and said you had a small operational issue with the HOA, I did not picture this. I thought you had a fine to pay. It looks like you declared independence and established your own sovereign nation." Rico, ever a man of few words, surveyed my setup. He walked over to the beast, ran a hand along its metal flank, and looked at the tidy connections on the panel. He gave a single, slow, approving nod. "Clean install," he grunted. It was the highest praise he could offer. "Gentlemen," I said, hopping off the tailgate, "welcome to the aftermath. Our esteemed president decided my project needed to be shut down via a padlock. I, in turn, decided her authority needed a practical demonstration of its severe limitations. Now I'm thinking, we make this permanent. Gus's eyes lit up. Permanent how? I want to be off their grid for good. I want to trench a new, completely independent power line for a fully integrated, comprehensive water mitigation and energy independence system. I want it permitted. I want it city-approved. And I want it 100% immune to the whims of a woman with a laminator and a grudge. We spent the next hour huddled around the hood of Gus's truck, which was littered with schematics I'd already printed. We mapped out the plan. A new, dedicated meter base installed by the city. A trench for a new conduit that would completely bypass the community junction box Karen had tampered with. Upgraded internal wiring. And, as a final flourish, a secondary high-capacity pump to supplement the main array. Gus was practically giddy. The city utilities department is going to love this. They hate it when HOAs mess with infrastructure. We'll file the permit application this morning. We can call it a critical infrastructure hardening project. They'll eat that up. As if on cue, the final act of our little drama began. Karen von Stroheim emerged from her front door. She had changed out of her battle yellows and into a crisp blazer, an attempt to project an air of authority that was severely undercut by the swampy ruin of her front lawn. She marched across the street with grim determination, holding a new piece of paper in her hand. No doubt a formal demand for the immediate removal of the beast, and probably a bill for the damage to the community aesthetic. She was 10 feet away when Gus, seeing her approach, held up a hand. "Morning, ma'am," he said in a loud, cheerful voice that carried across the quiet street. "Glad we caught you. Gus from Gus and Rico's Electrical. Just wanted to give you a heads up that we're here to begin preliminary survey work for Mr. Peterson's project." Karen stopped, momentarily confused. "What project? He is in violation. This facility is being removed." Gus smiled, a wide, friendly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He tapped the screen of the tablet he was holding. "Ah, that's where you're mistaken. We filed the emergency permit application with the City Planning and Utilities Department about an hour ago. They were very interested to hear about the neighborhood's unique infrastructure challenges from last night. Something about potential endangerment by a civilian entity tampering with emergency infrastructure. They loved that part. Anyway, they fast-tracked the permit. Here's our work order, and the city permit number is right there at the top." He turned the tablet so she could see the screen. It was an official city document, stamped with the municipal seal. Gus went on, his voice full of helpful professionalism. "So this new system will be tied directly to the city's main grid with its own separate meter. It'll be a fully permitted, inspected, and protected utility line. The city guys were very clear on that point. Any interference with it, like, say, cutting power or blocking access, would be a direct violation of city utility regulations. The fines are apparently quite steep, payable by the interfering party, or in this case, the HOA as a whole." The color drained from Karen's face. She looked at the official document on the tablet. She looked at Gus's cheerful, unmoving expression. She looked at Rico, who was standing with his arms crossed, a silent, immovable mountain of a man. She looked at me, and I gave her a pleasant, two-finger salute. Her eyes darted around the neighborhood. Curtains were twitching. Mr. Henderson was unsubtly sweeping his porch, watching the whole exchange. Mrs. Garcia was getting her mail for the 3rd time that morning. The entire neighborhood, the community she was supposed to command, was watching her fall. Her authority was gone. Her power was an illusion. She had brought a bylaw to a power struggle, and she had lost. Without another word, her shoulders slumped in utter defeat. The paper she was holding slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the wet pavement. She turned, and with the slow, shuffling steps of a deposed monarch, she trudged back to her house, leaving her final unserved notice to dissolve in a puddle on the street. The war was over. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air smelled of wet earth, cut grass, and victory. The beast was powered down, resting silently in the garage, its work done. I was sitting on the lowered tailgate of my truck. Next to me were Dave, Gus, and Rico. We all had a cold beer in hand, condensation trickling down the bottles. It was a scene of perfect, tranquil satisfaction. Dave, who had spent the day as my second-in-command, a man transformed from a panicked gnome owner into a confident logistics expert, raised his bottle. "To the Harmony Creek microgrid," he said, a grin splitting his face. "May it never need to be deployed again?" "And to its enemies," Gus added with a chuckle. "May their lawns be ever soggy." I clinked my bottle against theirs. "I'll drink to that, but I think I'll propose a different toast. To spite, the most powerful and perhaps the most underrated of all renewable energy sources." They all laughed and drank to that. Karen resigned as HOA president a week later, citing personal health reasons in a terse email to the community. No one was surprised. The legend of the flood, of the orange padlock, and the great roaring beast had already become neighborhood lore. I was no longer just Alex Peterson, the quiet engineer. I was the guy who'd stared into the bureaucratic abyss and switched on a generator. A few days later, Gus and Rico finished the permanent installation. The new conduit was buried deep. The new meter spun quietly on the side of my house. And the new discharge pipe they'd installed? It was 2 inches in diameter, twice the size of the old one. It was a flagrant, glorious violation of at least 6 different aesthetic bylaws. No one's ever said a word about it. It turns out that in the suburbs, people value peace, quiet, and perfectly manicured lawns. But when the water starts to rise, they value a guy with a monster generator and enough cable to reach a friend. And that's a kind of property value you'll never find in an HOA covenant.